I wanted to give you a couple of announcements and updates. Travis Audubon is not planning to host any indoor in-person events for the rest of 2020. But because Austin is now in stage 3 and we hope we will continue to improve, that we are planning to slowly and safely add some outdoor modified events back to the calendar. So we are planning some select bird walks, field trips, and sanctuary work days that will be restricted and have modifications, but we hope to slowly restart some of that outdoor programming. Of course, please know that we keep monitoring local COVID conditions, and we will only proceed, obviously, as conditions improve, and we hope that they continue to. I wanted to share some exciting virtual events that we have coming up. You might have already heard about our annual Victor Emanuel Conservation Award. Used to be a luncheon. This year it's an event, 6 p.m. on October 2nd. Registration is free. You can sign up on our website, and we're pretty sure it might actually be a very fun evening. We're honoring Sheila Hargis, who many of you know and love. She's much beloved by Travis Audubon. For me and many of us, she was our first birding guide and instructor in the Intro to Birds class. And Sheila has been instrumental in Travis Audubon's organizational growth and success, and we're thrilled to be able to honor her. So please go to our website to learn more. We really hope you'll register today. It's going to be a lot of fun. As you know, Birdathon looks a little different this fall, but we are excited and hope that you'll be able to join us. You can find lots of information on our website, travisaudubon.org/birdathon. And note that there are a handful of open spots still available for a couple of Birdathon trips this year. So if yours was canceled or you're interested in doing a modified trip, there are some spots left, so you can contact Kaylee or go to our website for more information. And I just wanted to preview a couple of great things we have coming up in November. We're going to have a virtual birding week where we are going to do some birding from our computer from Colombia, Panama, Costa Rica, all at the click of a button. So we're really looking forward to that. We'll keep you posted. And Kaylee is working hard to plan a virtual bird trivia night. All of that is to come in November. We'll have more information soon. So now I'd like to introduce Rich Kostecki, who is an amazing birder and naturalist, and who last year showed me the difference between a Hutton's Vireo and a ruby-crowned kinglet. So if you ever get the chance to bird with Rich, I highly recommend it. He's here to introduce his friend and tonight's speaker, Dr. David Semprich. So let's welcome Rich. Hi, Rich. Over to you.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce the speaker tonight, Dr. David Semprich. I first met him back about 18 years ago when I started on the Fort Hood project as a publications specialist, and got to know him there. We collaborated on a variety of projects. I even was his supervisor for, I think, for a few years there. He was generally well behaved and didn't need too much supervision, so that was nice. I'm sure he's going to go into it about the history of the Fort Hood project, its importance in terms of the research that's been done on the Black-capped Vireo. He's been an integral part of that research, and I want to emphasize how foundational that work has been to informing the recovery of the species. It was endangered. It is currently delisted, and a lot of the work that came out of Fort Hood and a lot of the work that David has done has had a profound impact in informing that recovery on that. He's probably learned more about Vireos than just probably about anyone I know. He may be part Vireo on that, and certainly involved with their management, but he also, as his bio indicated, he's a master bird bander, and he's a really great teacher of that. And being a bander, he also gets into esoterica, like molt limits and all kinds of crazy stuff that makes your normal birder go cross-eyed. So, he has a lot of really in-depth knowledge. And again, it's my pleasure to introduce him tonight. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Rich, and hello, everybody. So for the past 20 years, I've been monitoring Black-capped Vireos at Fort Hood. And so this evening, I want to tell you a little bit about that work and some of the things that we've learned along the way doing it. Actually doing this work, what it involves mostly is a lot of walking, and much of that walking is spent literally following individual vireos, trying to map out their territories and find their nests. And this makes you intimately familiar with individual birds and gives you the chance to learn a lot of things that you wouldn't otherwise imagine are going on out there with these birds. Not sure why I'm having difficulty switching to the next slide.
You might have to click on your PowerPoint just so it's back on the PowerPoint and not on the Zoom. Try that.
Yes, that worked. So anyway, yes, you get intimately familiar with these birds. And so I wanted to give you a little example of that, tell you a little story, something that happened in the 2008 season. So there was this female that was on the study area where I was working, and this was her band number, so that's how we'll call her. And she settled there and mated with a male with this band number. And they built a nest, and she laid 4 eggs in it. And then something happened about a week and a half later. The male disappeared, and I never saw him ever again. But really quickly, another male stepped in and took his place, the one with this band number. And this male assumed all the duties at this nest that a normal black-capped vireo would do, a normal male would do, like sharing incubation duties with the female and feeding the young. And so the nest succeeded in fledging 4 young. And then about 2 weeks later, she left the territory, and she left 3 of the fledglings behind for the male to look after for the next several weeks. And she took 1 with her. And they moved off to another territory of a male that was at least 7 years old who had this band number. And after a few days, that male adopted the fledgling. So it followed him around and he fed it. And if I got too close to them, he scolded me. And in the meantime, this female started a new nest in that male's territory and had another successful nest, her second of the season. So this one fledgling that stayed with her the whole time was raised by 1 female, but 3 males in sequence. And again, this is the sort of thing that you get to see when monitoring birds. Next, let me tell you a little bit about Fort Hood. On your screen there, this is the complicated shape of Fort Hood. And as you probably know, it's a large place, about 219,000 acres. And just like Texas is divided into counties, Fort Hood is divided into little smaller units called training areas. And that's what the little lines dividing up the shape of Fort Hood are on this map. And you'll see this map again from time to time throughout the presentation. Fort Hood is known as the Great Place. That's its nickname because it's a great place for soldiers to serve and live. And when I first came to work at Fort Hood, I, in a short time, started myself to think of it as a great place. But I was never in the military, and my point of view was completely different from that of a soldier. And so to me, it was great because of its abundant natural assets. Next, let me tell you a little bit about the bird. Birds of the genus Vireo are only found in the Americas, and of the 34 species that are currently recognized, the black-cap is unique in that it's the only one in which the plumage of the male differs from that of the female. So the male usually has the cap that's black, and the female typically has a gray cap. At 8 to 10 grams, this is also one of the smallest vireos. There are none smaller, but there are a couple others that are equally as small. And it's so small, it's smaller than the golden-cheeked warbler, and by mass, only about half as big as a red-eyed vireo. So this is a really small bird. This is its range map. It currently breeds from Oklahoma down through central Texas over to West Texas and then down into northeastern Mexico. Historically, it bred up into Kansas a little bit, but it hasn't done that for about 70 years. Its wintering range is shown here in red. Throughout this breeding range, there are several currently known large populations, and what is thought to be the largest in any one place is at Fort Hood, and that's right where the red dot is on your screen. But there are several other large populations. For example, there's a large one at Wichita Mountains National Wildlife Refuge and the adjacent Fort Sill military installation in Oklahoma. There's also one at Kerr Wildlife Management Area, and there's another occupying the canyons adjacent to the lower Devils River in West Texas. And then there's evidence that there may be several large populations breeding in Mexico as well. The main component of black-capped vireo habitat are shrubs, and shrubs that are ideally adjacent to little open spaces covered by grass or other forbs, bare rock, sometimes even bare dirt. And what these openings allow is for light to come in and reach all levels of the outer perimeter of the shrubs. And this supports the growth of leaves at those areas and down low. And it is in these areas that the vireo hides its nest. Most vireo nests are in the height range of from knee high up to about chest high, although we've seen them lower and much higher as well. If you look down from above on really good vireo habitat, it has this clumpy appearance with the clumps of shrubs and the openings surrounding them. But it occurs in other areas too with fewer openings or smaller openings. So what is it that creates this kind of habitat structure? Well, in central Texas, the key to vireo habitat is disturbance. And by disturbance, I mean anything that can suddenly and dramatically change the vegetation on a site. And these are things like fire, flood, and storm winds. And in central Texas, these things change the abundance of plants in the vireo habitat, and they change the growth form of the plants there in ways that favor the vireo. Let me tell you a little bit more about what I mean. This picture is taken in a place 1 year after a fire. The tree on the right, the dead tree on the right, that has a pretty straight trunk and pretty straight branches is an ash juniper. This species is one where in a fire, if it's hot enough, the above ground part of the tree dies, and that also kills the root system, so the whole plant is dead. The tree next to it, the more crooked one over here, this is a plant called shin oak, and this one has 2 trunks, and the fire also kills the above ground part of that tree as well, but it doesn't kill the root system. And in response to this disturbance, it sprouts from many, many places in its root systems. And so in the picture, this shin oak and some of its neighbors have literally carpeted the ground here with little sprouts coming up. So what the fire has done here is it's reduced the abundance of ash juniper, and it's caused the shin oak to go from a multi-trunk tree to a very dense shrub, at least for a while. And shin oak isn't the only tree that does this. There are others as well. It's just shin oak does it in a particularly extreme way. This other picture that I've just put up here is a Texas red oak, and it's got 2 large trunks and maybe 2 or 3 lesser trunks, and they've all been killed by a fire. And you can see the abundant sprouts coming up all around from the root system there. And when this grows up a little bit more, anywhere from 6 to 12 of those trunks will survive for a while, and that's a good stage for black-capped vireos to nest in them. So on Fort Hood, we have natural disturbances, but much more common are man-made disturbances. For example, we have very heavy vehicles driving across the habitat, crushing down shrubs and knocking over trees. We also have unintentional fire, often set by flares used for training at night. If they come to earth still burning, they can start a fire, and also exploding munitions. The aftermath of a fire is shown in this picture, and this was caused by helicopters firing rockets at targets on the ground. We also have intentional fire. For various management purposes, we intentionally set fires. And then a lot of management to facilitate training occurs on Fort Hood. And basically what they do is they go in and with a machine like the one shown here, grind up all the trees and shrubs. And this kills the junipers and causes the shin oak and others to resprout, so that 3 to 5 years later, vireos will be using the site. So the fact that disturbance is still a significant ecological force on Fort Hood allows the species that inhabit shrubby areas to thrive there. So it's kind of what seems at first like a paradox. Because this is a military installation used for military training, shrubby habitats are abundant, and the creatures that live in those habitats are also abundant, including the black-capped vireo. This is that map of Fort Hood again, and this one shows in brown all the places where we have black-capped vireo. I want you to notice these 3 areas that I'm circling right here, kind of up in the northeast, that are particularly large areas of vireo habitat. Those were all created by unintentional fire. So we have a lot of black-capped vireo habitat on Fort Hood, but it wasn't always that way, or we didn't always have a lot of black-capped vireos on Fort Hood. When monitoring first started there in the late 80s, they found less than 200 vireos there. And a scene like the one in this video may have been typical back then. So we have a nestling with a little bit of fuzzy down on the top of its head, begging for food, and an adult feeding it. And then the adult's going to take away a fecal sac. Songbird nestlings produce these fecal sacs, which are feces coated with a gelatinous bag that holds the feces together so the adult can remove it from the area. So it doesn't serve as a signal to predators that there's a nest there. But there's a problem here. Black-capped vireo nestlings do not have down on their body. This is a brown-headed cowbird nestling that these vireos are feeding here. So when we first started monitoring back in 1987 and 88, we found that slightly more than 90% of the nests were parasitized by brown-headed cowbirds. And what that means is that the cowbird has laid an egg in the vireo nest to leave the vireos to raise the young. What happens in those nests typically is that the Vireo eggs fail to hatch. And if they do hatch, the young die after a couple days because the cowbird's nestling is bigger and can reach higher and get most of the food. So early on, right away, we knew that if we were going to cause our population to increase, we had to decrease nest parasitism in some way. So the main way we tried was to trap cowbirds and remove them. This is a cowbird trap, and it's baited with food here. There's water in this container. There's food on this hanging feeder, and also to lure cowbirds in, there are other cowbirds in this trap. The picture in the lower left shows the roof of the trap, and so you can see the slot through which the cowbirds enter, but then have great difficulty getting out of. So we put these at first in the Vireo habitat, and they were only slightly successful. And so we wondered what was going on. How could we have a bigger effect? So back in the 1990s, the Nature Conservancy did a study of the movements of cowbirds on Fort Hood using radio telemetry. And this picture shows a cowbird with a radio transmitter attached to its lower back. And one of the main things that they found was that on Fort Hood, cowbirds lead this kind of dual life. Typically in the morning, they'll go to places where they want to parasitize nests. So they're looking for nests, they're mating, and they're wandering around looking for these nests and placing their eggs in them in the morning in places like Black-capped Vireo habitat. Then in the afternoon, they go to pasture lands where they forage, often in groups, often in the company of cattle. So our traps are trying to lure in cowbirds with food and other cowbirds, and cowbirds just aren't that interested in those things in the morning when they're in the Vireo habitat. So we moved our traps to the pastures, and at that point started to be much more effective. This graph shows the number of cowbirds that we removed every year for a long span of years there. And you can see it took us a while to get good at this. But then after a short while, we were removing a couple thousand Vireo or brown-headed cowbirds from Fort Hood. And correspondingly, this graph shows what happened to the parasitism rate. It started around 90% of nests and then gradually dropped and remained low. One thing I want to draw your attention to in these graphs is this area right here, these latter years, where we had a sudden drop in the number of cowbirds that we removed, yet parasitism still stayed relatively low. In fact, some years very low. Those 2 years, 17 and 18, it was 0%. So the reason that happened was because we got better at recognizing which cowbirds would parasitize Black-capped Vireos on Fort Hood, and we removed those and set the others free. So let me tell you a little bit about that. This was a study that Rich Kostecki, who introduced me, was one of the principal investigators on. So this picture shows two cowbirds. One is light colored and the other is darker colored, more richly colored. The light one on the left is of the Obscurus race, and this one breeds in Texas. The one on the right, the darker one, is of the Artemisiae race, and this only migrates through Fort Hood. It doesn't breed there. So if we could tell the two apart, and we learned how to tell them apart, we could just remove the Obscurus and let the Artemisiae go. Also consider this graph. This shows the number of both these local breeders and migrants that we trapped each month for 4 months through the spring. In March, we're catching a lot of both. In April, we're still catching a lot of both kinds of cowbirds. In May, we're catching hardly any of the local breeders, but we're still catching a lot of the migrants here. in June, we're hardly catching anything. So what we learned from this information was if we only trapped in March and April, we would be getting most of the local breeders that we could catch. And we would be saving ourselves the trouble of catching and releasing all these migrants in May. And so that's what we have done ever since. And it's been pretty effective. So here's the timeline of what happened to the Black-capped Vireo. And in 1987, it was listed as endangered. And this listing happened in October. Earlier that same year, in the springtime, we started monitoring Black-capped Vireos on Fort Hood. So we're anticipating it being listed. Over time, over the next 30 years, Black-capped Vireo populations increased dramatically at several locations. And in 2016, the Fish and Wildlife Service proposed delisting the species. And it took a couple more years for this to happen. And so they were delisted in 2018, and a 12-year post-delisting monitoring plan was established. So this year, 2020, was year 2 of that post-delisting monitoring. So on Fort Hood, we plan to continue monitoring this species for another 10 years till 2030. Now I want to tell you more specifically about the monitoring program. We have, in this monitoring, we have 2 main objectives. The first is to determine the abundance and distribution of Black-capped Vireos on Fort Hood, and the second is to determine their reproductive success. Now, this is a lot of work to do, and I don't do it all by myself. So every year I have a seasonal crew that works with me, and this picture shows this year's crew. So as I go through this presentation, I'm going to be using the pronoun we usually instead of I, because in most cases it's a group of us doing these things and finding things out. We do a number of activities to monitor, and these can be categorized into 4 main activities. The first 3 are banding, mapping territories, and finding and monitoring nests. And these we do in study areas. And the final activity, something called distance sampling, we do across Fort Hood. So what I'm going to do the rest of the presentation is go through each of these activities, tell you a little bit about it, and tell you some things that we've learned while doing it. But before I do that, let me just briefly mention our study areas. This picture shows where those study areas are currently located. And some of these areas we've been monitoring since back in the 90s, continuously every year. A couple of the study areas, namely these 2 up here, are much newer and were created for a special purpose. So we start banding vireos right away. We get busy right away because we can't tell one vireo from another unless they have a unique combination of colored rings on their legs. So we can't really do anything else until we can tell them apart. And up here in the upper right of this slide, I show you the numbers that we've banded last year, just to give you an idea of the scale of this work. You can see we banded a lot of adult males and females and a whole lot of nestlings. Now, not only does this allow us to identify the birds and keep track of different birds, but it gives us a lot of other information. For example, we find out how many birds come back, how many birds we banned one year, how many of those come back the next year. And this graph shows that number across a number of years back to the 1990s. And you can see some years, this year it was really low, only 15%. And this year it was really high. That was about 55% came back. The blue line marks the average, and that's close to 40%. So each year we don't have to band all the Black-capped Vireos on our study sites. We usually only have to band the remaining 60% that weren't there the year before. We got to find out how long vireos live when we mark them, ban them and mark them. And our current longevity records are 13 years old for males, and we've seen that in 2 males, and at least 12 years for females, and we've seen that in 2 different females. So those are the extreme old birds, but to get an idea of what's more typical for these birds, I looked at 16 cohorts of birds that we banded when they were 1 year old, and then plotted out how long we continue, how many years we continue to see them, and presumably that's how long they lived. This graph shows that. So you can see here that most of the birds lived 2 or 3 years, but a few lived considerably longer. And this is pretty typical for small songbirds. Most of them don't have very long lives, but a few individuals can live surprisingly long. Oh, by the way, our birds, this is pretty typical age longevity records for vireos. There are a few that are less than that and a few that are a little bit more than that. When we capture and handle black-capped vireos to put bands on them, we get to see a lot of details in their plumage. And when I first started this work, it was thought that the look of the head of the males could tell you whether it was a 1 year old or a bird that was older than 1 year old. And this was thought to be the 1 year old look, with black on the front of the head, but gray on the back. Since then, we found that this isn't really that reliable. Generally, it's true, but there's a lot of variation, enough so that it's not reliable. This is what we found. This shows the 6 basic head patterns of black-capped vireos and what percent of 1 year old males, older males, and juveniles had. Same for females. So this is that pattern with the gray on the back of the head. And you can see that, yes, 1 year old males predominantly had that pattern, 87% of them, but the remaining 13% had other patterns. Furthermore, a lot of the older birds, 11% of them had this same look, and even more strange was that some of the females had this same look. So we even had to work out other ways to tell the males from the females when they had these intermediate plumages. And we did work out a couple of ways. For example, we found, and this was kind of odd, you wouldn't think that this would be something to look at, but we looked at the color of the roof of their mouth and found that during the breeding season, males and females differ in this color. But then at the end of the breeding season, they both change to the same color. So just to convince you that it's sometimes not so easy to tell the males from the females, I have this video here of an adult with a black cap coming in to feed nestlings, and then another adult with what looks like a black cap also feeding the nestlings. The second bird is the female. And in a little bit here, the male shows up and passes some food to her so she can feed the nestlings. So just looking at them through binoculars, sometimes you can't be certain. Often, most of the times you can, but in some cases you can't be certain of whether it's a male or female. We got to find out, because we ban nestlings, we got to find out some things about their dispersal. Here's that map of Fort Hood again, with a bunch of blue lines on it. And what these blue lines represent is one end of it, each line is at the place where we banded a nestling, and the other end of the line is where we found and recaptured that bird when it was a breeding adult. So you can see that a lot of these dispersals, this kind of dispersal is called Natal Dispersal. A lot of them on this map are very close to our study areas. And that's not too surprising, because that's by far where we spend most of our time looking for vireos. We don't get out in these other spaces and look around nearly so much. In fact, we get there very little. But nonetheless, we found a lot of these birds banded as nestlings out there. And some of these lines are so long, they just barely fit into Fort Hood, which suggests that the scale of natal dispersal is probably bigger than Fort Hood itself. And indeed, we've been lucky enough over the years to observe 6 natal dispersals outside of Fort Hood, mostly from Fort Hood, between Fort Hood and Balcones Canyonlands National Wildlife Refuge. And the farthest of these were 78 and 75 kilometers. That's about 48 miles. And the picture here is actually one of the birds that dispersed 70 some miles between these two areas. If you're ever out there birding and you happen to see a black-capped vireo that has a colored ring on its leg, I would really like to know about it, because there's a very good chance it's one we banded when it was a nestling. So another banding study that we did involved young birds that were old enough to be independent of their parents. What we did is we tracked them with radio telemetry. This is a transmitter here. They're quite tiny and they have a fine wire as an antenna. We attached them to the lower back of the bird with a little harness so that the antenna trailed out behind over the bird's tail. The reason why we did this is because I started noticing that there were quite a few of these young vireos occupying habitats that were close to water and that had willow trees and buttonbush and giant ragweed. And this is a habitat where the black-capped vireos do not breed. So I was wondering what's going on. Why are these hatch years in this habitat? Why are these young birds there? So I collaborated with a graduate student from the University of Illinois, Erica Dittmar, and Erica is shown here on the right in the green shirt, putting a transmitter on a vireo. And what Erica found was that if she captured the bird in a habitat near water and she tracked it, it tended to stay in that habitat. In contrast, if she trapped it in black-capped vireo breeding habitat and tracked it, those birds had a strong tendency to wander and go visit other habitats. Now, when these young birds are independent of their parents, it's summertime. It's June, July, and August when it can get hot and very dry, as it did this summer. And the habitats near water often stay green in these conditions. And as shown in this picture, the vireo habitat often becomes very dry and brown. And so another thing Erica found was that the insect abundance was much higher in the habitats near water than in the vireo breeding habitat. So the vireos seemed to be wandering around looking for the best place for them to forage and survive. Early on in this project, I think it was in the very first year of it, one of the first vireos transmitter on, I attached a transmitter to a young male. And we immediately started tracking him. And after 3 hours, he became stationary. And so what I thought is, a vireo wouldn't stay still for a long time like this. So what I thought was that somehow the transmitter had fallen off the bird. It had become detached and fallen to the ground. So we went to find the transmitter so we could use it on another bird. And we found that the transmitter was still attached to the bird. It's just that the bird and the transmitter were inside a small copperhead, a species that we didn't previously know was a potential predator of black-capped vireos. Another thing we found out through banding is that as the breeding season winds down, vireos start wandering around, so that in our study areas where we've carefully found and marked all the males that live there, suddenly new males start showing up, and lots of them. So we start catching lots of birds that we hadn't seen there before. And we find this wandering going on in other places too. And here's a particularly extreme example from 2 years ago. We caught this female with this band number. She was 1 year old, and we caught her on the 25th of June right here. And then 2 days later, on the 27th of June, we were banding and we captured her here on the other side of Fort Hood, 15 miles away. So what's going on with all this movement at the end of the breeding season? Well, I looked at what happened to those birds those new birds that we caught on our study area at the end of the breeding season, and saw what they were doing the next year. Were they still on that site, or were they gone? And I found that about a quarter of them, about 25%, were territorial on the site where we caught them. So this is evidence that what's going on there at the end of the season is the birds are prospecting around for the spot where they'll go to breed next year. It's likely that many of these birds probably were unsuccessful where they tried to breed in the current year. So because we have all these birds individually marked, we are able to map their territories. And we do this by going around looking for them and then noting the location where we saw each individual bird. And over the course of a breeding season, we'll end up with a map that looks like this. What this is it's an aerial photograph. And in the aerial photograph, you can see things like trails that we drove on and smaller trails that we may have walked on. And each symbol represents one individual bird. So these blue symbols here to the left are all one locations for one bird, and these green symbols are a different bird, its neighbor. Black-capped Vireos are territorial, and these are locations for males. So what you expect is for each cloud of dots to overlap only a little or not at all with its neighbors, because they're trying to keep each other out of their territories. And that's what you see in a lot of places on this map. But look at the middle here. What's going on here? Particularly in this spot here, just south of the trail, you see yellow squares, blue squares, dark pink circles, and light brown circles. 4 different birds all in the same space. What was going on there? What were these 4 birds doing? Well, it turns out that the birds weren't all there at the same time. They used this space in sequence. One bird came in, used it for a while, and then left and moved somewhere else. And then another bird came in and eventually left. And so this spot had 4 birds over the course of the breeding season, whereas this area here looks like it perhaps had 3. So one thing that often triggers them to leave is the failure of a nest or the failure to get a mate. So what happens to these birds? Where do they go when they leave? Well, in some cases, in a few rare cases, we've been able to see the birds on the study area moving around different days in different areas and being quiet the whole time. So it seems like they're some of them are adopting a non-territorial lifestyle during this period, but others are doing something different. And that's what I'm going to show you in this picture. This is a different study area. And I want to draw your attention to the bird represented by these white symbols here. This bird moved into this spot early in the season, attracted a mate, had a nest, and the nest failed, and its mate disappeared. And so it sang for a lot for a while, trying to attract another mate. Didn't get one, and after a couple of weeks, it relocated 600 meters to this area down here, where there are some more white dots. Down here, it attracted a mate and nested again. Same thing happened to the bird symbolized by these red circles. This bird had 2 unsuccessful nests and then relocated up to this area where it took us a long time to find it. And it had, by the time we found it, it already had a nest, and that nest was successful up there. Another thing that's kind of interesting to note in this picture is after this red bird left that area, this blue-green bird that was its neighbor started using the vacant space there. Anyway, this sort of sequential use of territories and movement from one place to another is something we've seen many times. So most of our time out in the field when we're monitoring these birds is spent trying to find nests, because this can sometimes take quite a while. But it gives really valuable information on reproductive success. And there are many ways to measure reproductive success. And one of those is shown here. This just shows all the different years from 1997 to 2019. And it shows what percent of the males that we monitored succeeded in having one fledgling, at least one fledgling. And you can see there were some good years. There were some very good years. These two, 70-some% of the males succeeded. And then periodically there are poor years where something closer to only 40% succeed. Again, the blue line's the average, and it's about 55%. So roughly you can think of this as about half the birds on average succeed and about half fail in any given year. Another way to measure reproductive success is the actual number of young that they succeed in fledging, and that's graphed here. And that shows a very similar picture with really good years and really bad years. And the average here is about 2, but there are actually very few vireos that fledge too young. Most of them fledge 0 or 4, because 4 is the most common number of eggs that they lay. And so a bunch of 2s and or a bunch of 4s and a bunch of 0s often average out to around 2. We get to find out some interesting things about these birds when we monitor nests. So let me tell you a story about this bird. This is just from 2 years, from last year, from 2019. The female with this band number settled down on this study site. This is a site I was monitoring, and she settled into the territory of the male represented by these red circles here on the far right. They had a nest, and it came close to succeeding, but a predator ate the nestlings. And so they nested again, and that time the eggs got eaten by a predator. So what she did is she abandoned this red male here, and she moved 400 meters over to the white male over here, and she mated with him. So they had a nest, and she laid eggs in it, and it only lasted a couple days before a predator ate the eggs. And this time she gave up right away, and she moved over to his neighbor over here, the bird represented by the blue circles. This was really good news for this blue bird, because he had been there, at this point, he'd been there almost 2 months and had not succeeded in getting a mate yet. So finally, early June, he's finally got a mate. They make a nest. She lays 3 eggs. 2 of them hatch, and they produce 2 fledglings. So over the course of the breeding season, she had 4 nests and 3 different mates. And this is very common. Females move around a lot. Every time a nest fails, they have the choice to abandon that male and move to another male, or stay. If the nest is successful, they have the same choice. But here there's another complication. If it's successful, she can decide whether to take some of the fledglings with her, all of the fledglings with her, or leave them all behind for the male to take care of. And we see all of those things happening. So the last activity that we do is distance sampling, and this is what we use to estimate the abundance of vireos on Fort Hood. And I'm not going to go greatly into the methodology except to say that to do distance sampling, you basically do surveys where you go to a known point and stand there for a set amount of time and then measure as best you can the distance between you and all the vireos that you can hear singing. And we measure this distance in a couple different ways. And one is to use a laser rangefinder, which the person in the picture here on the right is doing to measure the distance. But we do this at hundreds of locations across Fort Hood. And this is the 400 and some points that we were going to do in 2020, but COVID-19 threw a monkey wrench in this, and we were unable to do any of these, although we were able to monitor most, but not all of our study areas this year. So we'll have to get to these points next year. And these data allow me to come up with an estimate of how many vireos are out there, how many male vireos, because they're the only ones that sing, within some margin of error, and these little marks show the margin of error. But in general here, the story is that over the years we've been doing this, the vireo population on Fort Hood has been increasing to a peak of around 8,000 back in 2018. And you see, in 2019, we had a dip in the numbers here. And that's likely because right after the 2018 breeding season, we had some large fires that burned up some vireo habitat. So like I said earlier, it usually takes 3 to 5 years for the shrubs in those to grow big enough for the vireos to reoccupy those sites. So hopefully in 2022, our numbers will start, will go up again. So this work is a challenge for us out there in the field. It's difficult to find nests. It takes a lot of patience and a lot of persistence. It's also really difficult to see the color bands on these small, fast-moving birds that stay deep in the shrubs very often. But the breeding season is often a challenge for the vireos too. As I said, usually only about half of them succeed in producing young. This next slide shows you a vireo, vireos successfully meeting this. Oops, let me go back there. This is vireos successfully meeting the challenge of the breeding season. On the last day that young are in the nest, on the day they leave, the adults bring food and they show it to the young, but they don't feed it to them unless the young follow them away from the nest. So it's an apparent attempt to lure them out of the nest. And that's going to happen here soon. But also something I think is rather remarkable happens, in that the female comes and actually sticks food in the bill of this youngster, and then she snatches it away and flies off. So let's just watch this video and you'll get to see this happening. This fledgling has spent its whole life up till now in the nest, so it's never had to balance on a perch, and so it's a little bit wobbly at first, and you'll see some evidence of that. Here comes the female. You see her stick the food in and then take it out. She shows it to him again and then flies off with it. And it worked. The youngster follows her. And there are more nestlings down in that nest, so you might see a little bit of movement going on down there. And the last thing you see in this video is the next youngster trying to climb up to the rim of the nest. So I'm going to end with this slide that shows several organisms that occur in Black-capped Vireo habitat. And I've enjoyed giving this presentation. I thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have at this time.
Thank you so much, David. It was a fabulous presentation. We got a lot of questions while you're talking, so I'll just kind of work our way through. There were some questions about the bird's historical range, and Byron asks if it's possible that disturbance from bison grazing and migration historically contributed to the disturbance that the black-capped vireo needs for its habitat.
That's an interesting idea. I've never thought of that. That's entirely possible. My guess is that would be in places that were really close, areas with woody plants that were intermingled with grasslands. You wouldn't expect maybe the bison to go too far into forested areas. So I still would guess that fire probably would have been the main thing that created and maintained vireo habitat back then. But yeah, that sounds entirely possible that bison could have played a role as well.
Cool. And another question about if cowbird parasitism was at very high rates when you all started your work, if it was historically at 90% or higher, how do we think black-capped vireos survived that?
Oh, that's another good question. And another thing we don't really know is what the population trend was before, whether it was decreasing or whether it was just stable at a very low level. Certainly we've seen when we relax cowbird parasitism pressure that vireos expand into a lot of habitats, a lot of areas that we never even used to consider vireo habitat before. So really, I don't have an answer for that question. Don't really know how they made it through that period. It could be that extreme parasitism pressure was a fairly recent event, something that only happened in the last 20 or 40 years before we started monitoring them at Fort Hood, and the population was able to hang on through that period, even at a low level.
Great. There were a couple of questions about the estimated vireo, black-capped vireo population in the entire world, and also a specific question about if it was still resident in southern Oklahoma. I know you said it was not in Kansas anymore, but still in Oklahoma.
Yes, it's currently, let's see, I can't remember this off the top of my head, but I think it's currently occupying at least 3 sites in Oklahoma. The one site that I mentioned at Fort Sill and the Wichita Mountains National Wildlife Refuge, but the other sites are sites occupied by much smaller groups of vireos. But yes, they're there, and there may be others on private lands that we don't even know about.
Mm-hmm. And worldwide, do you have an estimate of the population?
Not a good estimate. Up until recently, people in different areas have estimated how many vireos are in their area using different methods, and it's hard to get them all together to come up with a global estimate. And so I don't have a good estimate. I can only speculate pretty wildly on that.
And the bird's winter habitat in Mexico, do you know if there have been attempts to preserve it, if it is, in danger in any way?
It would be good to know more about their habitat in the winter, but what we do know is they tend to occupy a variety of successional habitats, a variety of shrubby habitats at different altitudes in the winter. And it seems like those areas are still very abundant and don't seem to be under big threat. And the fact that anytime we have new habitat appearing on Fort Hood, it immediately gets, very quickly gets filled up with vireos, suggests that their population isn't being limited by what happens on the wintering ground. It's being probably at this point being limited by the availability of habitat in the breeding grounds.
Wow, that's great. Several questions about banding. Do you know anything about if banding affects the reproductive success of the birds?
As far as we can tell, no. We get, most years we get most of the birds that we monitored banded, but there are some years where, in most years, there are a couple out there that we just can't catch, but we can still recognize them by the fact that they're surrounded completely by neighbors that are banded. So we're able to monitor a bird that isn't banded, and those birds seem to do just as well as the other birds. We haven't seen any noticeable difference between them.
Okay. And how many birds, it looks like the birds had 4 bands. Is that how many they all get? And how much do the bands weigh?
Let me start out with how much they weigh. They weigh 0.06 of a gram. So they're pretty darn small. They also represent a very small proportion of the 8 to 10 grams of the Vireo's total weight. Some of the birds have 4 bands. They wear a metal band that has a number on it, and that band's a little heavier. I can't remember off the top of my head what it weighs. I think it's closer to 1/10 of a gram. And then they have plastic bands. So some get 3 plastic bands and some get 2, and the nestlings just get 1. And the reason why we just put 1 on the nestlings is so if we see those birds later on, wherever they are, we know immediately that's a bird we banded as a nestling. So we really want to catch it and find out where it came from. But so basically in the color combinations of adults, we treat their legs as having 4 positions. And in some of our color combinations, the upper position is empty.
Wow, that's so cool. There's a question about the delisting, and it seems like the population certainly at Fort Hood is thriving, but say you found evidence that during your 10-year study that wasn't the case. Is there a process for relisting during that period, or is there like, how does that work as far as the official list goes?
Oh boy, that's a question I cannot answer. I do not know what how that works. And I'm not even sure if that's happened with another endangered species where it had to be relisted during the post-delisting monitoring period. The typical procedure after delisting is to have at least 5 years of monitoring afterward. And it's, I thought it was a good thing to extend it longer for the Black-capped Vireos, because changes in cowbird parasitism might not occur in just a couple years. It may take several years for us to find out what's happening.
Okay.
But yeah, sorry, I can't, I don't.
No, that's, well, it seems like it's good news that they're doing well, so maybe we'll.
Yeah, that would be a good question for some of our Fish and Wildlife Service colleagues to know the ins and outs of the process.
Right. If there are folks who want to see Black-capped Vireos, perhaps before they take off, if they're not already gone, where are some good places that you would recommend that they can see that are accessible to the public?
They're accessible to the public. Balcones Canyonlands National Wildlife Refuge and Wichita Mountains National Wildlife Refuge are 2 really good places to go look for them. Sometimes you can find them in the vicinity of Fort Hood. I like to bicycle a lot, and I bicycle around, and as I'm bicycling around, I often just hear Black-capped Vireos somewhere off in the habitat adjacent to the road. So if you live in the vicinity, sometimes you can find them that way just by driving by places that look shrubby. Usually on Fort Hood, usually our vireos stick around a few days longer than today. But this year, last week's cold front seems to have cleared them out. On Friday, I was able to find one. Yesterday, I could not find any, even though I was walking around in really excellent habitat, playing some recordings of songs, trying to get them to respond. So it seems like mostly they're gone, but we have seen them occasionally, a few stragglers into early October.
So when will they come back? We'll put it on our calendars.
Okay, it's late March, and it varies. Our very earliest, let me see off the top of my head, I think it's the 12th of March is our earliest date, but more typical would be like somewhere in the mid-20s, like around the last week of March. They're usually much more in evidence. Before that, it's a few scattered individuals that often don't stay put.
Yeah. And someone is asking about if they want to come birding at Fort Hood, is there a way to do that?
There is a way. There is a process to do that. You can purchase a recreational pass. You have to come onto Fort Hood to do that. If you contact me later, I can send more specific information about where you go and you purchase a pass. I believe it costs $20 a year, and it runs from August of one year to August of the next year. And on Fort Hood, the military units, when they train, they sign up for different specific training areas. And so there are some weeks when certain training areas have nothing going on. And so you're permitted to go to those areas for recreational activities, a variety of activities. One of those is birding. And so they have a system where you use your phone to check different areas to see if they're open for recreational use that day.
Very cool. Very good. I think we made it through all of our questions. This was a really fascinating talk, and really appreciate your time and your effort in putting this together. And thank you for all your work. It's very impressive, and it makes me feel great to know that the Vireos are doing so well. So thank you, Dr. Cimprich. Thanks to everybody who joined us today. You can look for the recording on our social media channels, maybe even tomorrow. So we'll talk to you later. We'll see you next month.
Okay, thanks again.
Take care. Bye, everybody.